Dawn rolled over the Carolina field slow and easy like a tired old dog stretching after a long nap. And the whole world around the Hawks family land was wrapped in that early morning hush. That made folks who lived far away from the noise say, "Dang, this is what peace feels like," and the rising sun sent long gold ribbons through the tall pines, while the breeze drifted across the soybeans like a whisper from the earth itself. And out there walking his daily path down the gravel drive was a man named Brandon Hawks, who had grown up on that soil. The way some kids grow up on basketball courts or back alley sidewalks, except his world was roots, and tractors and fence lines, and the comfortable quiet that settled over the land each morning. Moved steady boots crunching on old gravel that had been laid down by his father way back, when Brandon was small enough to ride on the back of the hay truck. And every breath he took that morning was just easy, slow country air, untouched by anybody's business except God and whatever critter was rustling through the brush. And his mind wasn't on anything heavy, not bills, not fights, not problems. Just the good plain rhythm of chores waiting to be done and machines that needed greasing and maybe a jar of honey he meant to pick up from the east field, because the beekeeper left it on a stump for him every few weeks. The land had a quiet heartbeat that matched his own, and it carried stories older than his bones, the kind of stories that lived deep down in the dirt and in the creak of old barn doors, and in the way the morning fog always clung low to the fields like it didn't want to leave. But that morning something felt just a tiny bit off, not enough to raise alarms, not enough to make him stop walking, but enough to make the hair on his arms twitch like a tune. He couldn't quite remember opening the old mailbox at the end of the drive, expecting the usual stack of junk mail equipment catalogs and utility bills printed on paper, so thin you could almost see through it, but instead his hand hit something stiff and heavy tucked at the top, a cream-colored envelope thick enough to feel like it belonged to someone with too much money and not enough humility, and there was a fancy green logo pressed on the corner like someone wanted whatever was inside to look official and important. Even before a man opened it, Brandon frowned, a deep, slow frown, the kind that pulled at the corners of his mouth and made his jaw tighten just a touch, and he slid his thumb under the seal, hearing that soft rip of expensive paper giving way. And he stood there by the mailbox in the soft sunlight, letting the breeze brush against his face as he pulled out the letter inside and unfolded it with fingers that were stained from machine grease. And honest work. Then the number hit him on $100,000 and 100 freaking printed right there, bold, like someone decided to scream through the paper and punch him in the chest. And for a second his mind blanked out like a TV losing signal, and he stared at it, trying to make sense of what kind of joke this was, because no way, no possible way in this world was some hoa asking him for that much money. His heartbeat thudded, heavier, but not fast, more like a slow drum announcing trouble marching down the road. And he read the rest of the letter, watching the words turn mean in the morning light. Unauthorized structure, architectural violation, community standards breach, mandatory fine, and other nonsense that belonged in some shiny suburb with matching mailboxes and cranky neighbors, not on a 130-year-old Carolina farm, sitting on its own rightful land. To let out this small laugh, not because it was funny, but because it was so stupid it almost twisted into comedy. And he looked at the barn, the new one. He had poured his sweat, heart, and wallet into the one thing on this whole farm that he built for himself after years of putting everyone else's machines back together, and that barn sat shining red in the sunrise, proud as anything, and absolutely not breaking a single rule of anything, because it sat for 100 feet inside his property line. His laugh died in the wind, though, replaced by something heavier, something old and sharp, something that lived deep in the Hawks bloodline. The instinct of men who lived close to the land and understood when something out there was trying to crawl under the fence. He walked back up the drive, letter in hand, jaw set like stone, and the land around him seemed to shift just a little, like it already knew what was coming before he did. And inside the house, he slapped the letter on the kitchen table, watched it skid across the wood, and he grabbed his phone with hands that were steady but tense. He called the number on the letter, and it rang and rang until a robotic, soft little voice came on saying, "Welcome to Willow Crest Estates, Hoa. Please leave your name, lot number, and nature of complaint." And he almost snorted out loud at that lot number, like they really thought this man lived in some tiny plot surrounded by cookie-cutter houses instead of a spread of land big enough to swallow their whole development twice over. Left a calm, polite message because his daddy raised him right, told them they were mistaken, told them he had no lot number, told them his land had been recorded under the Hawks family name since 1891, told them to call him back and fix whatever nonsense they started, and he ended it the same way his father always ended things: appreciate your time. Though inside, he didn't appreciate a single thing about the situation. He hung up and stared at that envelope like it was some venomous snake curl, upright on his dinner table, waiting to bite anybody who got too close. And the kitchen felt too quiet, the kind of quiet you get before a storm rolls in across the pines. And he paced a moment, hands on hips, breath slow, eyes darting to the window, to look at the barn again, shining strong in the morning light. Then something in him shifted like a gear locking into Placidus. Wasn't a slip-up, wasn't a lost letter, wasn't some misprint on a form. This was somebody reaching across a line they had no right to cross. His boots thumped across the wooden floor as he went into his office, pulled open the old metal filing cabinet that squeaked louder than it should, and he started hauling out every deed, survey plat, tax receipt, and handwritten note his family saved through 3 generations, and he laid them all across the table. In a storm of paper that smelled like old ink and history's sun climbed higher, but the air in the house stayed heavy like it was watching, waiting, listening. That Brandon combed through document after document with the concentration of a man who wasn't gonna let anyone rewrite his truth, and that slow burn inside him grew stronger. Not rage exactly, but something colder, something like steel forming. In the foreget for an hour, he needed fresh air. He went outside, walked toward the southern field, and the closer he got, the more his chest tightened with a strange sense he couldn't name. And when he reached the boundary where old pine trunks marked the border between his farmland and the fancy neighborhood beyond, he stopped dead in his tracks. Something felt wrong, not wrong like a sound or a smell, but wrong in the bones, wrong in the ground, wrong in the way the air held itself around him, like the world was whispering, "Pay attention, boy, something ain't right." He could see the edges of Willow Crest Estates from their neat beige rooftops, poking above the trees like nosy strangers peeking over a fence, and he stared at them, long and hard, feeling his jaw clench with a slow, cold anger that didn't flare, but tightened, gripping inside his chest like a fistus. Wasn't over, not by a long shot. Right there in that thick Carolina air, with the sun warming the back of his neck, Brandon Hawks made himself a silent promise, one carved deep into the roots of his land and the bones of the men who came before him. Nobody touches Hawks' land, nobody steals so much as an ink, nobody sends threats to a man whose family carved their life into this soil before those HOA folks were even an idea scribbled on a developer's napkin. Whispered it low under his breath, voice barely louder than the wind sliding through the pine needles. They picked the wrong man's land, and they sure as hell picked the wrong man to mess with, and the land around him seemed to hum in agreement like it had been waiting for him to realize it all along. The next morning, the Carolina sun crawled up over the ridge slow and heavy like it was dragging itself out of bed after a long night, and the Hawks' land sat hushed under a soft haze of gold light drifting across the fields, while dew clung to the tall grass like little diamonds. And Brandon moved through the yard with the same steady rhythm he had every day, but his mind was not as calm as yesterday, and the air felt different, thicker, heavier, like something was coiled out there in the world, waiting to strike. It had been up since before dawn, flipping through old maps and deeds again, trying to make sense of the crazy letters sitting on his table. But no matter how many papers he checked, no matter how many times he traced the boundaries with his finger, everything always came back the same. This was his land, and that fancy HOA had no authority within 100 yards of his fences. And still that letter sat there, bold and rude, like it owned the Placidus. Stepped out behind the barn, grease rag hanging from his pocket, and he bent down to tighten the stubborn bolt on the sprayer rig, the sun warming the back of his neck, while a soft hum of cicadas buzzed through the pines. And for a moment he let himself breathe slow and steady, trying to push off the frustration balled up in his chest, when suddenly he heard something that didn't belong. Tires on gravel, not just any tires, some heavy, expensive, quiet kind that moved too slow and too smooth for a farm road, and he straightened up, automatically wiping his hands on the rag as he stepped from behind the tractor and saw it creeping up his long driveway like a black shadow sliding across the land that didn't want it there. A brand new Lexus SUV, shiny enough to blind a man if the sun hit the hood just right. Brandon took one slow breath, trying to ignore the instant drop in his gut, because nothing good ever came rolling up a long southern farm road in a luxury SUV. And the vehicle didn't pull to the side or wait. Politely it stopped halfway up the drive like it owned the dirt it was sitting on, and sat there humming with the low growl of a spoiled Engineth driver. Door opened with a soft, expensive click, and out stepped a woman who looked like she got lost on her way to a fancy wine tasting. Not a farm in Bladen County, heels sharp enough to dig holes in the earth if she dared walk, a far lavender blouse clean enough to make the dust jealous, sunglasses big and dark, hiding everything except the way she carried herself, like the world should bend when she walked through it. She didn't even look at the land, didn't take in the barn or the fields or the sky, she looked straight at Brandon, like she'd been rehearsing it in the mirror. "Mr. Hawks," she said, voice sharp enough to slice butter straight out the fridge. And Brandon lifted one brow, slow and unimpressed. "And you are?" he asked, his tone politely rude in that quiet southern way that lets people know they are already testing. His patching chest woman smiled, the kind of smile rich folks wear when they want to look friendly, but mostly just look smug, and she clutched a clipboard against her chest like it was a badge. "My name is Karen Willoughby," she said with pride dripping from every syllable. "President of the Willowcrest Estates Homeowners Association." Behind her the passenger doors opened, and two men climbed out, one wearing khakis and a tucked-in HOA polo shirt that made him look like he ironed it 6 times this morning, and the other carrying a measuring wheel like a weapon. Though Brandon could tell instantly not a single one of them had real surveying experience, because real surveyors didn't show up without permission, and real surveyors didn't look scared or grasp. Brandon took one slow step forward, boots crunching loud in the gravel, and his eyes locked on a woman who marched up his driveway. "Like she owned it. You delivered that letter yesterday?" he asked, voice low, steady, not shaking, not angry, just cold like river water in winter. Karen lifted her chin a little. "We did," she said proudly, "and I am here to verify a potential setback violation concerning the structure you placed near our community boundary." Brandon blinked once slowly. "My structure," he repeated. "On my land," she sighed, the way city people sigh when country folks don't obey quick enough, and she tilted her head just slightly, like she practiced patience only on days ending in Y. "You may be unaware, Mr. Hawks, but the southern end of your property was included in the Sierra Group's 2016 development expansion documentation, which places this region under Willowcrest's extended architectural review zone." Brandon's jaw tightened, his hands curling loosely at his sides, because that was the stupidest sentence he had heard all month, and he listened to a screaming turkey buzzard stuck in a drainage pipe last week. "My land," he said slow and heavy, "has been recorded in my family's name since before your subdivision had a single streetlight, since before your developers even knew this county existed, since 1891, ma'am." But Karen didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't even look confused. Instead, she turned toward her measuring man and said, "Start from the eastern post, please, and verify the footage." The man lowered the wheel, hesitating, like he could feel the tension building in the air, but he took a shaky step forward, and Brandon moved faster, stepping between him and the fence line, planting himself like a cinder block sunk deep into the ground. The temperature of the air didn't change, but the mood did, a crackle of something invisible rising between them like static before a lightning strike. Karen froze mid-step, her clipboard dropping a little, and for the first time, she looked uncertain. "Mr. Hawks," she started, "you're being uncooperative." Brandon stared at her eyes, steady, voice low enough to rumble, "And you're trespassing." For a long breath, nobody moved. Pine branches swayed behind them, like even the trees were holding their breath, waiting to see who'd blink first. Finally, Karen exhaled sharply and pulled herself together. "You have 14 days, Mr. Hawks," she said, turning toward her SUV. Failure to comply will result in escalation. They climbed into the Lexus and rolled down the drive, leaving a long, thin trail of dust floating behind them, like a ghost refusing to fade. And Brandon stood there, boots planted in the earth, chest rising slow and heavy when the dust settled. He didn't yell, didn't curse, didn't throw anything. He just walked slowly back toward the house, his mind sharpening with each step. And when he reached the porch, he paused, staring south toward the beige rooftops peeking over the tree line, and he murmured something only the wind would hear. "This ain't a misunderstanding. These folks are coming for something." Inside the house, he sat down at the table, filled with old papers, files, maps, deeds, and he arranged them one by one, like puzzle pieces clicking into place. And the deeper he looked, the more the knot in his stomach tightened, because none of this made sense unless someone was hiding something. Night rolled across the land, thick and deep, crickets screaming from the brush, stars glittering like dust on black velvet. But Brandon didn't sleep. He sat in that old chair, tapped his thumb against the table, and replayed every second of his afternoon confrontation. Karen's little smirk, her calm voice, her measuring guy inching toward the fence. Her so-called development Zana didn't fear them, but something inside him stirred, something old and heavy, carried from one Hawks generation to the next, a warning whisper that lived in bone and gut, saying, "Stay sharp. This ain't normal." When morning came, he was already on the porch, sipping coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and staring at the sunrise, turning the sky orange and red. And something about that red glow felt like a signal. His daddy used to say red mornings meant trouble coming. Just after 9, he heard tires again, this time fast, hurried, nervous, and he tensed, instinctively stepping off the porch, expecting Karen ready for round two. But instead, it was a skinny kid, not more than 20, hair gelled stiff like he dipped it in concrete, and a polo shirt with that stupid Willow Crest pine cone logo stitched over his chesty. Didn't even speak, didn't make eye contact, just held out a cream-colored envelope with shaking hands like it was a cursed object. Then he sprinted back to his car and peeled off like he was escaping a haunted house. Brandon opened the letter in the driveway, the sun beating down on his shoulders, and his stomach dropped as he read words even crazier. The last time escalation, increased penalty, additional fines, daily fees, enforcement mechanisms. Property seizure. Each line felt like a shove, not a mistake, not a warning, a threat. Folded the letter slow, real slow, the way a man folds something when he knows a battle is coming. And he walked inside, grabbed his phone, and dialed the one person who handled this kind of nonsense better than anyone in Malister. If trouble had a scent, Ron could smell it a mile away. He picked up on the second ring. Brandon, he said, I was expecting your call, expecting trouble. Are you psychic now? Brandon muttered, son. Ron replied, trouble loves you more than your tractor does. Brandon read every line of the whole letter, and Ron listened without interrupting, and when he finally spoke, his voice was different, darker. This ain't stupidity. He said, this is calculated. Someone's trying to rewrite the line on paper and hope nobody checks the ground. Brandon's jaw locked. What do? We respond, officially certified mail, full documentation, and from now on you do not talk to that HOA without me. Brandon agreed and hung up, then immediately called Jace. Because this wasn't over, and because his gut was screaming at him to get that line checked again, and that's exactly what he would do. Storm hadn't hit yet, but the first thunder was starting to rumble. The morning Jace pulled up, the sun was barely crawling over the tree line, and the air felt cold enough to bite a man's knuckles, and the Hawks land sat quiet, like it was holding its breath, waiting for whatever truth was about to get dug up from the soil that had seen more storms and heartbreaks than most folks would ever understand. And Jace's old diesel truck growled down the long gravel drive, puffing out smoke like a tired bull in winter, and Brandon stood by the barn wiping grease off his hands while the mist curled around his boots. And he watched his friend climb out of the truck with that familiar half grin that meant, yeah man, I'm here, but also yeah man, this might be bad. Jace was the kind of fella who could read land the way city folks read phone screens, and he walked with that slow, calm confidence of a man who didn't rush for anyone except maybe his mama or a dying tractor. And he dropped his heavy survey case on the ground with a thunk that echoed across the field like a warning bell, and Brandon felt something coil tight inside his chest. Because he trusted Jace's eyes more than any county map or government plat. You look like hell, bud, Jace muttered as he sipped from a thermos the size of a gas can. And Brandon shrugged in that exhausted way a man does when he's been up all night wrestling ghosts that live on paper instead of under beds, and he pointed toward the southern edge of the property where the fence line cut through tall grass. Like a scar left by generations, they started walking, both silent, both heavy in the boots, and the air around them felt thick like the whole land was listening closely, and the sun was warming the earth just enough to let the dew rise like smoke off the fields. And the closer they got to the boundary, the more Brandon felt that tightening around his ribs. Like a belt someone kept pulling. Jace started unloading his equipment, setting up his tripod, leveling the ground, tapping the metal legs into the soil with care like he was performing surgery, and he sent the drone cruising into the sky, buzzing over their heads like some angry mechanical hornet, while his tablet flickered with live footage of the fields below. And Brandon stood nearby, listening to the rustle of pine needles and the faint hum of far-off traffic, and of course the whisper of his own Nervesh. Knew something was wrong. He'd felt it deep in his gut for days now, but knowing and seeing were two different beasts entirely. And as the drone scanned the land in precise little grids, Jace's face changed slowly, like shadows moving over stone. First confusion, then suspicion, then this sharp stillness that made Brandon's stomach drop. Jace tilted the screen toward him. Look at this, he said, voice low. Brandon stepped closer, feeling the hairs on his arms stand up, and he saw the map overlay blinking softly, the boundary lines glowing bright red against real satellite imagery, and the red line that should have hugged the pines like it had for a century was slid out of place by several scary feet, like someone had grabbed the digital world and tugged it away from the real one. This ain't right, Jace whispered. This ain't right at all. They followed the line across the ground, marking it with survey flags as they walked, and the wind kept tugging at the little orange plastic corners, like the earth itself was trying to warn them away from whatever truth they were stepping toward. And Jace kept checking the coordinates, muttering numbers and cursing under his breath, and Brandon stared at the ground, feeling like the land was breathing beneath him, slow and angry. Then they reached the point where the old fence post stood twisted and leaning, the ones Brandon's granddaddy had hammered into the ground back when men used strength instead of steel machines. And Jace knelt down, brushing dirt away from one half buried Stake, and he squinted at the etching HL. He read Hawk's land. That was the moment the truth slammed into them like a freight train. Jace stood up real slow and drew a long straight line from the stake to the next corner marker. And then he followed that same projected line right across the grass toward the Willowcrest subdivision, and Brandon felt his throat tighten. As they both walked forward like men walking toward a fire. First, it was just grass, then a fence, then a kid's plastic slide, then a backyard deck built, all polished and pretty, and the line cut straight under it. Jace didn't smile, didn't joke, didn't even breathe deep. He just whispered, "Oh hell no." They kept walking past a grill, past a flower bed, past a garden hose coiled line cut right under the foundation of the first house. Brandon felt the world tilt, not the kind of tilt you get when you stand up to fast, the kind of tilt you get when everything you thought you knew suddenly wasn't true anymore. His voice came out low, slow, sharp like a blade dragged across stone. "The house is sitting on my land." Jay swallowed hard. "That ain't the only one, bud." They checked again, then again with different instruments, then again with GPS backup, and each time the line cut right through another yard, another driveway, another little piece of Willowcrest's perfect suburb fantasy house. After house after house, 9 of them. 9 whole homes sitting partly on Hawk's land, some sitting mostly on it, one sitting damn near entirely on it. Brandon staggered back a step like he'd been hit in the chest, and he braced his hand against a fence post, trying to catch his breath. Because this wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't some paperwork glitch. This wasn't a neighbor accidentally planting tomatoes to inches past the line. This was theft, land theft, neighborhood theft, generational theft. And the barn. They fined him for that clean red barn that sat for 100 feet inside his rightful border. They tried to use it to drag him into their mess. Felt anger rise slow and deep like a storm starting miles away. Not loud anger, not screaming anger, cold anger, quiet anger. The kind a man carries when he's been insulted in his own home they built on. "My land," he said again, voice shaking with disbelief. "They built 9 damn houses on my land while threatening me about a barn on mine." Jace just nodded, jaw-tight, eyes scanning the houses like they might explode. "Brandon, this wasn't an accident. Somebody moved that line on purpose. Somebody saw a strip of open land and got greedy. Somebody thought no one would ever check. Or maybe they hoped the old plats would fade into dust before anybody noticed. But I'm telling you right now, this is straight up encroachment, serious, illegal kind." The words hung in the air, heavy as storm clouds. Brandon turned to face the row of beige houses standing neat and shiny like obedient little soldiers, and something deep inside him cracked, not in weakness, but in awakening, like a sleeping giant in his chest opening his eyes. For generations, Hawk's men didn't start wars, but they finished them. His breath steadied, his shoulders squared, his mind sharpened, like a blade being drawn from its sheath. "They picked the wrong damn farm," he whispered. And the pine trees seemed to sway in agreement, their branches shaking like old spirits, saying, "Finally, boy, you see it. Finally, boy, you feel it." They walked back toward the old truck, both men quiet, both carrying weight heavier than tractors, and Jace rolled up the map with shaking hands, saying he would run everything again with the junior tech and archive data and original plats just to make the case airtight. Not that Brandon needed convincing. The land itself had spoken. The truth was carved right into the soil. When they reached the yard, Jace turned to him. "But listen to me, this is bigger than the barn, bigger than Karen, bigger than that fancy HOA boardroom nonsense. You gotta be ready for trouble, serious trouble." Brandon looked south toward the roofs peeking over the trees. "I've been ready since the moment that envelope hit my hand." But the world wasn't done shocking him, because trouble was already closer than he thought. Later that afternoon, when the sun was dipping low and the land glowed orange like a hot coal, he walked down to the mailbox for the second time that day, and inside, on top of a dusty seat catalog, sat a piece of yellow legal paper folded twice. No envelope, no stamp, no writing on the front, just a single message inside, written in thick black marker. Short, ugly, threatening. "Stop digging, you push." We pushed back. Brandon stood there, fingers curled around the note, the wind tugging at the edges, and a silence settled around him. Not peaceful silence, not natural silence, but a silence thick like a warning, like someone was watching, like eyes were on him from somewhere. The close fear didn't hit him, but instinct did. Old instinct passed through the bloodline. Then gear. He folded the note slow, tucked it in his pocket, and walked toward the house, each step heavier than the last. And when he went inside, he didn't turn on a single light, just walked to the old cedar gun cabinet, unlocked it with a small brass key, and pulled out his granddaddy's hunting rifle, running a hand over the walnut stock like greeting an old friend to check the chamber. Loaded it, set it on the nightstand beside his bed, not out of panic, but out of understanding. The piece of Hawk's land was gone. Something ugly was moving in the shadows, and he wasn't gonna let it spread. The night slid by slow on Hawk's land, and the dark pressed up against the windows. like something alive and stubborn, and the rifle on the nightstand just sat there quiet and patient, while Brandon tossed and turned in bed with that yellow note burned into his thoughts like a hot brand, and outside the pines whispered to each other in the breeze. Like old men talking about trouble they had seen before by the time the sky started to pale. He gave up on pretending to sleep and rolled out of bed, his feet hitting the cool floorboards with a soft thud, and he moved through the house. On habit, coffee brewing strong in the dented metal pot while the sun pushed a pale line of light over the eastern ridge, and the land slowly woke up around him. Roosters calling from somewhere down the road and a dog barking lazy in the distance. He sat at the kitchen table with his mug between his hands and a pile of papers spread out like a battlefield in front of him, and every deed, every map, every tax slip had the same story carved into it: Hawks land, Hawks boundary, Hawks history. And the more he looked, the more that cold, tight feeling in his chest turned into something steady and sharp like a steel cable drawn tight. The phone on the table buzzed and rattled against a stack of documents. And he glanced down to see Ron's name shining on the screen, and he answered with a tired grunt. That was close enough to a greetingman's voice came through low and rough like gravel under tires. And he asked if Jace found anything, and when Brandon laid it out for him 9 houses apart, or mostly on his land, the shaky line, the proof in the dirt, and the note in the mailbox. Ron went quiet for a long few seconds, the kind of quiet that says he is thinking fast and hard. Then he let out a slow breath through his teeth and said this was way past some little HOA temper tantrum. This was land fraud. This was criminal. This was the kind of thing that made judges rub their temples and call people into chambers, and he said they needed records, lots of them, and witnesses, and clean documentation, and they needed to stay calm and smart because greedy folks got real nasty when their little secret corners started filling with lies told. Brandon, he would reach out to some contacts at the county office and a zoning specialist who owed him a favor, and he told him to keep every paper safe and hold on to that yellow note like it was gold, because that was proof someone on the other side was scared enough to act dumb. When the call ended, the farmhouse got quiet again, except for the soft ticking of the old clock on the wall, and for a long moment, Brandon just sat there listening to it like each tick was counting down to something he could not quite see yet. Midday rolled in hot and bright, and he was out by the barn, checking the fuel filter on the tractor, when he heard it again, tires on gravel. The same careful, expensive sound, and his jaw clenched because he already knew what was coming before the black Lexus even turned the curve in the drive. Like a shiny B-light pulled up smoother than it had any right to this far out in the country. And this time it parked closer to the house with its nose pointed like a challenge at the porch, and the driver door opened on cue, letting Karen climb out, holding something in both hands, a glass dish wrapped in a checkered towel. Steam fogging up, the lich walked across the yard like it was a stage, and she had been practicing this entrance for days, and her heels sank just a little into the dirt each step. But she pretended not to notice. Her smile stretched wide and warm enough to make strangers think she was the sweetest neighbor. Brandon wiped his hands and walked up slow, meeting her at the bottom of the steps, and there was no smile on his face, just a steady look that said he remembered her clipboard and her threats, and he had not forgotten a single word. Good morning, she chirped in that sugar-sweet voice. Brought you something, apple cobbler, still warm. Figured we might want to start over. Neighbor to neighbor. He looked at the dish, then at her, and in that moment, it felt like a cheap prop, a peace offering from someone who had already decided what they wanted, and he nodded once, because his mama had raised him to be polite even when dealing with snakes, and he took the cobbler just enough to keep it from dropping, but he did not step aside. He did not invite her. And what can I do for you? He asked, slow voice. Flats laughed, a little too fast, a little too bright, and tucked hair behind her ear, though not a single strand was out of place. Well, there has clearly been some confusion. She said we value good neighbors at Willow Crest, and we do not want things to get tense over paperwork. Misunderstandings happen. Sometimes developers make things complicated. You know how it is. Brandon did not answer. He just stared, and the silence made her talk more, her words spilling out like she was trying to fill every inch of space, so he would not slip any truth into it. We are hosting a small gathering Friday evening, she continued. Just a few board members, some light snacks, free wine, chance to chat about everything friendly like. No lawyers, no drama, just community spirit. You are absolutely welcome. We would love to clear the air there. It was right there, under the fancy tone and soft smile. Fear not, fear of him, exactly fear of what he knew now. Fear of the line that did not leave. Cobbler dish was starting to weigh heavy in his hands, and he finally gave a small nod. I will think about it. He said. Her smile brightened like a lamp. Wonderful, I knew you were reasonable. We are all on the same team after all. He kept his face steady, even though his insides flared at that line, because there was no team here, and there never had been. And she turned and walked back to the Lexus, her steps quickening just a little like she could not wait to get off his land and back to whatever bubble made her feel powerful. The car slid away down the drive and left Brandon alone again, cobbler, in hand sun beating hot and fierce on his shoulders. And the whole thing felt off like a cheap movie scene where the villain brings cookies that evening. When the light faded orange over the barns, he called Ron again, told him about the smiling visit and the invite, and Ron did not even hesitate. He said Brandon needed to go to that gathering, needed to see their faces, hear their story, and more important, needed to watch what they tried to slide under his nose. You go, Ron said in that calm, steady tone. You smile, you shake hands, and you do not sign a single sheet of paper. They hand you no forms, no attendance slips, no friendly acknowledgments. You hear me? Not one. Brandon gave a low grunt. What if they push hard? Then you pushed back with silence and a lawyer on the end of your phone. Ron replied. The next 2 days crawled forward with long hours in the fields and quiet nights in the farmhouse, and not once did his anger burn out. Instead, it settled deeper like roots digging into the soil, and every time he glanced south toward the beige rooftops, he felt that rifle weight in the back of his mind, not the gun itself, but what it represented. A line drawn, a stand being taken. Friday evening slid and warm and sticky with the smell of cut grass and distant grills, and Brandon pulled on clean jeans and a button-up shirt that still smelled faintly of oil, no matter how often it saw the washing machine, and he grabbed his keys and headed out to the old pickup, the truck engine coughing awake before settling into a familiar rumble to follow the county road until the asphalt smoothed out and the world shifted from farms and scattered houses into manicured lawns and identical mailboxes, and he saw the Willow Crest sign, a head white stone with fancy letters and a carved pine cone acting like it had always belonged there, standing on land that used to be wild. An honest clubhouse sat near the front of the subdivision, designed to look charming, like something out of a lifestyle magazine. Big windows, warm light spilling across the perfect landscaping, and a wide porch decorated with potted plants that had never seen real dust. Brandon parked right out front in a spot that clearly was meant for someone who thought they were important, and climbed out of his truck, feeling the eyes of a few residents sliding his way from their tidy selves inside. The air hit him cool and sweet, smelling like scented candles, and soft jazz music floated around the room like it did not know it was trapped. And there were little plates of cheese and crackers and grapes arranged so pretty it almost felt rude to touch them. And his boots clicked against polished floors that had never seen real mud. Karen appeared instantly, like she had been watching the door, and swooped over in a cloud of perfume, her smile dialed up again. Brandon, so glad you made it. Come on and grab a drink. Make yourself at home. She pressed a glass of wine into his hand without asking what he wanted, and he took it but did not drink. He just let it hang there like a prop he was holding in someone else's play. And as he surveyed the room, he counted 5 board members all huddled together near the refreshment table, glancing at him like nervous birds, making sure the hawk stayed far away. On a small table by the entry sat a clipboard with a pen tied to it with ribbon, and at the top in neat type letters were the words Community Dialogue Sign-In, and under that a few names already scribbled, and there at the bottom in smaller faded print was a line long and dense like legal soup. He walked over and picked it up, and as his eyes tracked the tiny letters, he felt heat crawl up his neck, because buried in that paragraph was language about acknowledging community guidelines, accepting future compliance processes, and agreeing to resolve disputes through internal HOA resolution channels. It was not a simple sign-in sheet. It was a trap dressed up in friendly font. Karen drifted closer. Casual on purpose. That is just for our records, she said lightly. No big deal, just to know who attended this little neighbor meetup. Brandon lifted his gaze from the page and looked at her long enough for her smile to twitch just a touch. And in that moment, he saw the edges of her mask fraying, and he knew exactly what he was going to do. He gave a mild, polite smile, the kind that did not reach his eyes. Well, if we are doing paperwork, might as well keep it fair, right? He set the whole clipboard down and slipped his hand into his jacket, pulling out a folded document Ron had drafted that morning, a single sheet with straight, clear language explaining that he had filed complaints regarding boundary encroachment and questionable zoning changes, and that he had notified the HOA of these concerns on this date. It did not accuse anyone directly. It just said they were aware. He flattened it on the table and clicked his own pen. How about one for you to Karen, just for transparency? Something in her gaze flickered. Panic, confusion, habit, he could not tell, but whatever it was, she was running on automatic now. and before her brain caught up with what was happening, she had signed the page, her pen looping pretty across the bottom, and two of her bored friends moved over and signed as witnesses because that was what she wanted them to do. That was their normal pattern. Obey, sign, done, appreciate that, Brandon said, and he folded the document smooth and clean like a winning hand in poker, sliding it back into his jacket. He did not touch the HOA sheet. He did not hand it back. He did not sign a thing. The room buzzed with small talk and fake laughter and a few timid questions about farm life from people who had never stepped in real mud. And Brandon let himself drift through it, all nodding where needed, saying little, listening a lot. He kept catching phrases slipping out from the board. Members, manageable, resolution, quiet, settlement, easement, adjustment. And every time they glanced his way, their smiles tightened. After an hour, he set his untouched wine glass down on the snack table, thanked everyone in a tone that was polite but final, and he walked out of that clubhouse into the warm night air, feeling something in his chest loosen just a little, like the first nail had been pulled from a rotten fence. As he drove back toward Hawk's Land, the subdivision lights faded behind him and the sky opened up wide and dark and honest. And when his truck bumped back on gravel, his shoulders dropped, like he had been holding himself stiff for too long, and did not notice till he stepped back onto his own soil. The farmhouse glowed soft in the distance, and the barn stood tall against the starlight, hard and solid and real. And he parked the truck and sat there for one long moment, hand resting over his jacket where the signed page sat safe. For the first time since that cream envelope showed up in his mailbox, he did not feel like he was just reacting. He felt like he was finally pushing back inside the house. He laid the document on the table beside the old deeds and plats, and he stared at the inkware. Karen's name curled pretty and practiced, and he thought about how folks like her had never once expected to be the one standing on the wrong side of the line. The rifle still waited on the nightstand, but its presence felt different now, less like fear, more like a symbol. This was bigger than one barn, bigger than one farm, bigger than one man. This was about land and truth and lines that could not be moved just because somebody with money and a logo decided they wanted more backyard. Out on Hawk's Land, the night settled deep and calm again, but the calm did not belong to the HOA or to Willow Crest or to any paper pusher sitting behind a shiny desk. It belonged to the soil, to the people who honored it, and to the man who had finally decided he was done letting anybody else write his story for him. The war had not ended, but for the first time, it felt like the fight might actually be fair. The sun slipped up slow on Hearing Day, painting the horizon in pale orange streaks that melted into the soft blue Carolina sky, and Hawk's Land sat quiet and thoughtful like an old man, sitting on his porch sipping coffee and listening for something important. And inside the farmhouse, Brandon stood in front of the mirror, tugging at his collar like a man preparing for a fight he never wanted, but knew he owed to every ancestor buried on that soil. And the morning smelled like fresh coffee, pine, dust, and nerves thick enough to chew. Didn't sleep the night before, not a wink, not a minute. He'd lain awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence, listening to the weight of the land breathing steady under his house, and he kept replaying every encounter, every threat, every smug smile, every legal trick the Hoa threw at him, and it all piled up in his chest like wet logs ready to ignite the moment someone tossed a sparkler and showed up right at sunrise, knocking once and letting himself in, wearing a suit that looked like it had been ironed with pure frustration, his tie crooked in a lawyerly way that said he had been awake nearly as long as Brandon. And he tossed a thick folder on the kitchen table, the papers inside rustling like a storm waiting to break. "You ready?" Ron asked in that gravel voice of his, as ready as a man can be when the whole dang county is watching. Brandon muttered, fingers brushing over the polished handle of the folder, holding the deed old as history itself. "You're walking it with truth," Ron said, tying his tie a little tighter, "and truth hits harder than any bulldozer." They stepped outside, and the morning air slapped cool across their faces, the fields glowing soft gold, the barn shining proud like a guardian watching its land. And when they climbed into Ron's dusty sedan, Brandon took one last look at Hawk's Land before the trees swallowed it from view, and he whispered a promise under his breath that he'd bring justice back to the soil where it belonged. At the drive to the courthouse felt long and strange, like traveling into another world, one where men in stiff suits shuffled papers instead of soil, and where words on pages carried the weight of a hammer, and the courthouse itself rose out of the town square like some old stone beast, with pillars thick as tree trunks and steps worn down by a century of footsteps. And fear people were already gathering on the lawn, neighbors, farmers, folks from the next county, and even a handful of Willow Crest residents who looked pale, stiff, and confused, like they had realized they were standing on a ship sailing straight toward a waterfall and didn't know how to swim and then stepped out of the car boots, hitting the pavement slow and sure, and the crowd hushed. Just a little, watching him like a man carrying the weight of a whole story nobody else could tell. And Ron placed a steady hand on his shoulder, guiding him through the tall courthouse doors, into the echoing hallway inside. The floors were polished, marbles shining like rippled water, and every footstep, whether from lawyer, judge, or farmer, sounded louder than it should have, and Brandon felt small for a second, swallowed up by the cold stone space. But then he remembered the soil beneath his feet, the land that raised him, the truth tucked under his arm, and the fear melted off him. Like morning fog inside the courtroom, the air was thick with whispers and the smell of paper dust. And tension. Karen sat with her lawyers stiff and tight-lipped, her hair perfect, but her hands fidgeting in her lap like she couldn't stop them, no matter how hard she tried. And her board members were lined up like nervous kids, waiting for the principal to call their name, each one staring straight ahead, but looking like they wanted to crawl out their own skin. Brandon took his seat behind the defendant table, and he could hear the faint shuffling of the entire room behind him, everyone leaning forward, everyone waiting for the truth to turn the air. Electric judge entered, walking slow and heavy with age, eyebrows thick white and arched like a snowy ridge, and the whole room rose as one breath held at once. And when he sat, the world settled into a tense silence. Aaron stood first, file in his hand like a holy book, and he spoke clear and slow, explaining how the line had been moved, how the plats didn't match the ground, how 9 houses and an HOA office stood on Hawk's land like uninvited guests at a wake, and he placed each piece of evidence on the judge's bench one by one, the way a man lays bricks, building something solid, unshakable. Real maps, deeds, surveys, drone shots, GPS overlays. The signed acknowledgement from Karen, the yellow threat note, each one hitting the room like thunder rolling in from a distance, building, and for every piece of truth placed before them, Brandon felt the weight in his chest loosen, just a little, like tight ropes snapping one at a time. Then it was the whole lawyer's turn. A tall, thin man in a suit so dark it looked like it soaked up all the light around him, and he cleared his throat loudly like a rooster announcing morning. But his voice trembled just a little as he spoke. He tried to paint it all as misunderstanding, administrative confusion, developer oversight, but he didn't have the fire. He needed his arguments slip through the cracks in the room, like water leaking through rotten wood. And when Ron stood again, his voice cut through the lawyer's excuses like a chainsaw through dry pine. So this misunderstanding includes forging coordinates, Ron asked, rewriting boundaries, selling homes on land that does not belong to you, threatening the actual owner with seizure. Is that the misunderstanding you'd like us to believe? The whole lawyer stammered. Karen looked down, her face pale as the paper stacked in front of her. Then the judge leaned forward, his hands folded slow like he was preparing to carve the truth into stone, and he stared at the willow crest table so long the lawyer shifted in his chair like a child caught lying about something they shouldn't have touched. Mrs. Willoughby, the judge said, voice strong, did you or did you not sign this acknowledgement of notice months before filing your denial of awareness? Karen swallowed, her throat bobbed. She tried to smile. She failed. I believe I misunderstood. That was not the question, the judge snapped, lightning sharp. Did you sign it? A long breath hung in the room like a held storm. Yes, she whispered finally. I signed it. Her lawyer buried his face in his hands. Judge turned to the room, took a long, slow breath, and delivered his ruling, each word landing heavy like stones dropped in deep water. This court finds Willow Crest Estates and its board responsible for unlawful encroachment, unauthorized development, falsification of boundary documents, and the levying of fraudulent fines against the rightful property owner, Mr. Hawks, he said, voice ringing across the courtroom. All construction and access within the disputed zone will cease immediately, effective today, and all structures shall be removed at the expense of the responsible party. A hush swept the room, then a ripple, then a gasp. Then the world seemed to hold still. Karen's face collapsed like a wall caving in. Her lawyer looked ready to faint. The board members sat frozen. As fence posts bit behind Brandon, the crowd exhaled a wave of breath that sounded like a long-delayed victory. Aaron placed a hand on Brandon's shoulder again. You got your land back, he whispered, every inch of it. But the day wasn't done. Not even Clasetwo's zoning officials were called, and one stuttering excuses, one sweating through his shirt, both of them cornered by truth, like deer caught under the bright headlights. And when Ron produced metadata logs showing nighttime edits to plats, the judge's eyebrows shot up high enough to touch the lights in the ceiling. Deputies escorted one official out of the back door. Karen's lawyer tried to salvage dignity. He failed spectacularly. The judge hammered the gavel hard enough to echo off every wall, and the war that started with one ugly cream envelope was now laid bare for the whole county to see. Court dismissive words rolled through the room like thunder. Ending the storm, people rose slowly, whispering, watching Brandon as he stood, taking in the moment, taking in the air, taking in the truth that had fought its way to the surfaces. He walked out beneath the courthouse pillars. Sunlight hit his face warm and bright, and for the first time in weeks, the weight inside him loosened, and the breath leaving his chest was clean, full, real bit when he stepped onto the courthouse steps. Surrounded by murmurs and looks of respect and long overdue acknowledgement, he knew this wasn't the end. This was only the moment the tide turned, because he still had 9 houses sitting where they didn't belong. He still had a land scarred by greed. He still had a threat note tucked in his pocket. He still had enemies who weren't done fighting, but he wasn't afraid, not anymore. His boots hit the last step. Dust lifted around him, and the land called him home. Morning rolled in thick and hushed over Hawk's land like the sky itself was holding its breath, and every blade of grass seemed to stand a little straighter, like it knew something big was coming down the line. And inside the farmhouse, Brandon woke before the alarm ever thought about, buzzing heart already beating with that slow, heavy rhythm that shows up when a man knows today is the day nothing stays the same. And swung his legs over the side of the bed and sat there for a second, elbows on his knees, staring at the floorboards worn by 100 years of boots and bare feet. And he could hear the faint echo of old mornings stacked on top of each other, like lumber in the barn. His granddad moving through the house, his dad pouring coffee, somebody yelling about a loose fence line or sick calf, and over all that quiet memory floated the sound waiting for him outside today. Engine steel and justice with mud on its boots stood and walked to the window, the glass cool under his palm as he pushed it up, and the chill air rushed and smelling like wet dirt and pine dust and somewhere far off diesel. And when he leaned out, he could see a hint of orange flashing between the trees down the county road, the kind of orange that did not belong to Sunrise or tractors, the kind that lived on heavy machines and safety vests. For a long breath, he just watched the tops of the pines sway, heard the distant rumble grow closer, felt the land under the house vibrating soft like it was bracing to, and deep down, past anger, past fear, past all the paperwork, rage and courtroom noise, something else stirred in his chest, a strange, heavier feeling, like respect for what was about to happen, respect for the fact that sometimes justice did not come with pretty words, but with metal teeth. And dust in the kitchen. He poured coffee, black, strong, thick enough to stand a spoon in, and he drank it leaning against the counter, eyes fixed out the window as the sound of engines grew louder, rolling closer like a wave. And finally he set the mug down and stepped out onto the porch, boots hitting the wood with a hollow through, to walk down the path toward the southern field where Hawk's land met the edge of Willow Crest. And with each step, the noise sharpened into separate voices, the clank of metal buckets, the grind of tracks on gravel, the crackle of radios, and the steady rumble of diesel hearts beating under steel hoods. And when he cleared the last line of trees, he saw the whole scene laid out in front of him like some strange pair of excavators lined up in a row, their arms raised like giant metal arms ready to swing, bulldozers squatting low, heavy and patient, dump trucks waiting with open beds, sheriff's cruisers parked at angles along the road, lights flashing slow, and controlled county workers moving around in bright vests with clipboards and determined faces. And behind them, neighbors, families, strangers, all lined up along the ditch in lawn chairs, pickup beds, and on foot, eyes wide, phones held high to record the kind of day folks would talk about for years. The sheriff spotted Brandon and walked over, hat tipped low, eyes serious but warm, and he held a folded stack of papers in his hand, the court orders, thick and undeniable. Morning, Brandon, the sheriff said, voice steady. You sure about this? Brandon glanced past him at the row of beige houses lined up on his soil like plastic toys, then at the big shiny building squatting closest to the road, the Willow Crest office with its smug little sign, all perfect stone and smug lettering. And he felt that cold old anger surge once more before leveling out into calm. I did not ask for this mess, he said, voice low but clear. They brought it out here. I am just letting the land take itself back. The sheriff nodded like he understood that more than most. All right then, he murmured, turning to wave one of the excavator operators forward. You get first call. What you want gone first? Brandon stared at the houses for a long breath. Then his eyes landed on that office again, the one they used to spit out fines and threats and lies, dressed up in legal ink, and he felt his jaw clench. Start with their castle, he said, jerking his chin toward the office. Knock that thing down first. A murmur rolled through the crowd, not loud, just this low ripple of, oh dang, there it is. And the excavator operator, a big bearded dude with arms like tree trunks, grinned from inside the cab and fired the engine up, sending a roar across the field that made a flock of birds explode up from a nearby tree into the sky. The machine crawled forward, slow and heavy, tracks crunching over the gravel and grass like the earth itself was rolling under its weight. and the bucket rose higher and higher, casting a long shadow over the willow crest sign and the glass doors and polished stone columns. And for just a second, everything went eerily quiet, like even the machines were waiting. Then a voice cut through the air, sharp and shrill. "No, you cannot do this. You cannot touch that building." Every head turned as a silver SUV swerved to a stop, half on the road, half on the grass, gravel spitting in every direction. And Karen spilled out of the driver's seat in heels that were not built for dirt, hair not completely perfect, for the first time, eyes wild with a panic that had nothing to do with community standards and everything to do with losing control. Sprinted across the shoulder, waving her arms at the excavator like she thought she could physically stop it. And a couple of men in suits scrambled after her, one juggling a briefcase, one frantically checking his phone. "That is community property," she yelled, voice cracking. "That office represents hundreds of homeowners. You cannot destroy it. You have no right. This is illegal. This is harassment. This is theft." Brandon did not move. He just stood there, arms folded, watching her like a man watching a storm that came too late. He had already boarded his windows. Fourth sheriff stepped between her and the approaching machine, one hand raised lazily. "Mom, court order. Signed by the judge himself. Demolition of illegal structures on Hawks land. You know the drill." She spun toward Brandon, eyes flashing with something ugly. "You could have worked with us," she hissed. "We could have found a solution. You did not have to do this. You are ruining lives." For a moment, something tugged at his chest, because there were families caught in this crossfire. Folks who bought those houses believing what they were told, and he felt that weight heavy and real. But then he remembered the yellow note in his mailbox, remembered the fake cobbler smile, remembered the fine threats, lies she aimed at him before he even knew the full story, and his shoulders squared. "I did not build on land that was not mine," he said slowly. "I did not move lines. I did not lie to my neighbors. I did not send anyone a letter demanding $100,000 for living on their own dirt. You did that, not me." Her mouth opened and closed like she was searching for a word that didn't exist, because truth had just cut through her script like a chainsaw. And before she could spit anything back, the excavator bucket swung down. With a bone-shaking crash, the metal teeth punched into the front wall of the HOA office, stone cracking, glass exploding outward in a shower of tiny glitter shards, with framing snapping like skinny branches, and the sound rolled out across the field, deep and booming, rattling chests and windows, and maybe a few souls. Crowd gasped, some cheering under their breath, some just staring. And Brandon watched that once proud building shudder under the blow, its neat sign listing sideways, like it was finally admitting it never belonged there in the first place. The excavator pulled back, then drove that bucket in again and again, each hit ripping away more siding, more glass, more smug design decisions, until the roof sagged like a broken back and the front steps crumbled into dust, and the whole thing folded inward like a cardboard box, left out in the rancor, and screamed something wordless. High and raw hands balled into fists at her sides, tears streaking the careful makeup she usually wore like armor, and the men in suits grabbed at her arms, whispering about appeals and injunctions and emergency motions. But the sheriff just shook his head, holding up the stamped order like a shield. Nothing they threw at him was getting past that. Today, the office was nothing but a pile of busted stone, glass, metal, and splintered wood. The crew shifted toward the nearest house, one of the 9 that straddled the true line, like a stubborn trespasser, and a strange hush fell over the crowd again as the machine rolled forward. This one had wind chimes on the porch swaying and singing a sad little song in the breeze, flower pots lined up on the steps, kids' toys scattered in the yard, and a faded welcome mat by the door. And something inside Brandon twisted, because land might not lie, but people got lied to all the dang time. And he knew deep down some family had once looked at that front porch and thought they were starting a dream. He glanced around, and sure enough, a couple stood off to the side near the road, arms wrapped around each other, the woman wiping her face with the back of her hand. The man's jaw clenched so hard it looked painful, and he didn't need to ask to. No, that was their house. Guilt hit him quick and hot, but Ron's words from the courthouse echoed in his head. They did this, the developers did this, the board did this. You are not the one who sold stolen land. The excavator arm swung again, biting into the roof, tearing through shingles, trusses, insulation, and the house shuddered, letting out a groan like the ghost of every conversation, every dinner, every bedtime story held inside its walls. And Brandon had to look away for a second, staring down at the dirt, his dirt, the same dirt that had once stood quiet before anyone tried to claim more than they earned. House after house went down that day, 8 of them flattening under the relentless rhythm of metal and gravity, and every single time the machine hit wood, the crowd reacted in waves, some cheering sharp and hard, some crying, some filming with shaky hands. And all the while, Brandon stood near the boundary line, like a century absorbing every sound, every sight, burning it into his memory, because this was his land reclaiming itself. But it was also a lesson written in dust, greed always paid in rubble. Eventually Karen did not stop yelling until her voice turned ragged. And then, and even then, she kept pacing, snapping at her lawyer, threatening the sheriff, promising appeals, news coverage, political storm, nuclear lawsuits. You name it, and each threat sounded smaller and more desperate as another wall collapsed behind her and another roof sank into its own foundation. At one point she whirled toward Brandon, again, eyes swollen, voice raw. You will regret this, she rasped. When you think this is over, you have no idea what you started. He looked at her for a long moment, really looked past the nice clothes, past the board title, past the fake smiles, and saw a woman who had built her whole little kingdom out of lines and fines and fear, and now that kingdom lay in pieces on someone else's soil. I did not start this, he said quietly. You started it the day you decided paper was stronger than dirt. Afternoon sun dipped low as the last house caved in, sending a final cloud of dust rolling across the field. And by then most of the spectators had stopped talking. The cheering had died out, replaced with a quiet heavier than any noise, and all that remained, where the 9 houses and 1 office once stood, was torn up ground, piles of debris, waiting for trucks, and a rough scar cut across Hawk's land from where the machines had crawled back and forth. The sheriff walked over again, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, his uniform smeared with dust. That is the end of this phase, he said. Structures are down. Debris goes next. Then we are clear of the court order. He shifted his weight, like he had more to say, and he glanced toward the road, where another cruiser was pulling up, this one with a different energy in its movement, serious focus. Final county prosecutor pushed charges this morning, the sheriff added, voice low. Fraud, falsifying records, all that mess, and then some. There are warrants ready for certain folks. Almost on cue, the deputies stepped up beside Karen, calm, professional, hands resting easy near their belts, and when they said her name, she turned with that same disbelief she had worn in the courtroom, like the world daring to treat her like anyone else was an insult. You cannot be serious, she snapped. I am the president of the board. You cannot just drag me off like some common criminal. This is harassment. This is corruption. I will have your badges. The deputies did not flinch. Mom, you need to come with us now, one of them said. You can talk to your lawyer at the station. For a second Brandon thought she would try to run, but there was nowhere to go, no office to hide, and no houses to duck behind, just open land, and the eyes of the whole county watching. And finally she sagged just a little as they guided her toward the cruiser, her heels grinding dust into the dirt where her precious sign used to stand. The door shut quiet with a dull thunk, and the car rolled away, leaving only tire tracks and a long echo of everything that had gone wrong out here. The sheriff turned back to Brandon. You all right? he asked. Brandon looked across the field at the broken ground where houses used to stand, at the piles of lumber and glass and twisted metal at the boundary line, where the survey flags still flapped, and then beyond to his untouched rows of crops waving gentle under the late-day sun, and he felt a mix of things swirling in his chest. Relief, sadness, victory, grief. Feels weird, he admitted, like setting a broken bone straight. Hurts like hell, but you know it needed to happen. The sheriff nodded. World knows whose land this is now, he said. That matters more than their fancy signs ever did. As the machines shut down one by one, the growl of engines fading into a peaceful hum of insects and distant birds, the crowd slowly drifted away, leaving Hawk's land to its owner again. And when the last truck rolled out and the last deputy waved goodbye, Brandon stood alone on the scarred field with the smell of dust and crushed wood hanging thick in the warm air. He walked across the torn earth, slow boots crunching over fragments of tile and splinters, and he knelt down at the spot where the office lobby used to sit, pressed his hand flat to the ground, and closed his eyes. This dirt remembered pine roots and wagon ruts, not fake marble floors. It remembered his granddad's truck turning here at sunrise, not luxury SUVs. It remembered Hawks circling above and rain hitting open field, not sprinkler systems and paved parking. You are home again, he whispered to the land, voice shaky but sure. And I am not letting anyone move you on a map ever again. The sun slid lower, painting everything in deep gold and long shadows. And Brandon finally turned toward the farmhouse in the distance, its windows glowing faint amber in the settling light, and he started walking back, every step sending little puffs of dust into the air behind him, like the last bits of this battle lifting away. He knew there was still cleanup ahead, still lawsuits, still insurance fights and headlines and neighbors asking hard questions. He knew the next weeks would not be simple, but right then, in that moment, with the sky burning orange and purple and the pines murmuring in the breeze, and the weight of that Court order tucked safe inside his house, he also knew something else: the land was back on his side. The truth had taken root, and no matter how long the next fight lasted, Hawk's land was done being quiet for people who never listened in the first place. He reached the gate at the edge of his yard and paused, hand on the post, looking back one last time at the raw open stretch where the illegal houses once stood. And for the first time, he did not see their outlines in his mind. He saw rows of trees maybe, or open pasture, or kids from town picking fruit someday. He saw possibilities the land had been trying to show him all along. Then he stepped through the gate, letting it swing shut behind him with a soft, solid clang, and walked up the path toward the farmhouse. As the first stars started winking awake above Hawk's land, that finally felt like it belonged to itself again.